Good afternoon and good evening. This is Alfred Wu from Singapore. We are going to launch the first lecture under Sino-US Scholar Dialogue series on public administration. Before inviting the speaker, Professor Warner, I would like to invite Dr. Louis, Chair of Section on Chinese Public Administration of ASPA, to speak a few words.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. It's my pleasure to be here. My name is Mildred E. Lu. I am a professor and the director at the City University of New York, John Jay College. I'm also the elected chair of the section on Chinese public administration. Now, a little bit about the section. In my mind, this section is a place where those who are interested in Chinese and the comparative public administration gather, network, and share their research about Chinese public administration, obviously, but also internationally. Our goal is to advance comparative and Chinese public administration understanding via research and the dialogue. Okay, so we had many speakers. We have a Jeremy Hall, the PAR editor. We have Ken Meyer. We have Greg Van Ryzen about research methodology. And today I'm honored to have Dr. Warner from Cornell University to talk about fiscal health. A little bit about this series that we're doing. This is a series. This dialogue series is organized by the section as well as Zhejiang University. It's under the management of myself as well as my partner at Zhejiang University. She happens to have a meeting tonight, but her name is Professor Zhao. Two of us, met together, and we thought it would be a wonderful opportunity, not only for our section, but also for Zhejiang University to host this international dialogue. Because in current environment, given the global collaborations and political atmosphere, it is even more critical now than before to have international dialogue on important issues that are relevant to both sides of the world. So with that being said, I would like to welcome Yuanshuo. He will be introducing our guest speaker today, as well as our discussant. So Yuanshuo, it's over to you.
Thank you, Elaine. Good morning and good evening, everyone. My name is Yuanshuo Xu. I'm an assistant professor in School of Public Affairs at Zhejiang University. It's my honor to have you join this first China-US Scholar Dialogue series lecture on public administration. So I will be your moderator for today's panel. So today we have invited Professor Mildred Warner from the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University to give us a talk. Professor Warner is also my advisor for my both PhD and master studies. For 9 years. And Professor Warner's work focused on local government finance, service delivery, local policy in economic development, environmental and social issues. Dr. Warner pays attention to the shifting state-local fiscal relations in the context of fiscal stress, decentralization, recession, and privatization. Professor Warner's work also highlights the importance of human service as a part of the social infrastructure for development. So she actually, that's why how she came up with this idea of multi-generational planning approach for community development. And Dr. Warner also published over 200 papers, most of them on top journals in planning, field, public administration, urban studies, and geography. And today she's going to talk about the US local government responses to this fiscal crisis by comparing this very famous theory of austerity urbanism with her own idea on this pragmatic municipalism. And after Dr. Warner's talk, we are also very honored to have Professor Zhirong Zhao, as our discussant. Professor Zhao is a new dean at the School of Public Affairs at Zhejiang University. Before coming to Zhejiang this summer, he was a professor at Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. And he was also the founder and advisor of the Institute of Urban Infrastructure and Public Finance at the University of Minnesota. He is an expert of public budgeting and finance. also paying attention to the state and the local fiscal structures and how that affects local service delivery quality. Professor Zhao will give us about like 10 minutes for the comments and the discussions. Then we'll have our Q&A session. You are also welcome to type your questions during the whole lecture and the discussion. So I will collect your questions. Also, like for your information, the whole session will be recorded. Okay, let's welcome Professor Werner for today's talk. Mildred, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Yuanshuo and Elaine and Jerry and Alfred. It's really a pleasure to be able to present today in this US-Sino Scholar Dialogue for the China Public Administration Association. What I want to talk to you all today is how US local governments have responded to fiscal crisis. And as Yuanshuo pointed out, there's a theory out there of austerity urbanism that's very popular. And my own research has led me to articulate a theory of pragmatic municipalism because that seems to track more what local governments are actually doing in the US. So the austerity urbanism theory, which has been articulated mostly by Jamie Peck and then others, Donald Gray, who are working mostly looking at Detroit or cities that are really at the extreme of facing severe fiscal challenges, or also people who've been working in the UK, where the UK governments are about 70% dependent on state grants, and those state grants dropped by half in the Great Recession. So you see a hollowing out of services, and it's justified as a new localism, but citizens are losing access to basic services. In the US context, the exemplar case is Detroit or Flint. We have a picture here of a child and with a horrible Flint water crisis that had lead in the water. And the idea of austerity urbanism is that there's some kind of an austerity coalition of state, local, and business interests to starve city government, cut services to residents, privatize, increase user fees, and to do this especially in low-income and minority communities. And in fact, some people have gone so far as to call this the predatory city. It's a very, very dark view. I put down below a paper that Yoonji Kim and I wrote for Local Government Studies last year, where we looked at these two theories, our theory of pragmatic municipalism and this other theory of austerity urbanism, and really talked about the importance of paying attention to geography and the geography of where austerity is happening and what are the intergovernmental fiscal relations going on there, because the austerity theory doesn't actually fit the US very well. So our theory of pragmatic municipalism is something that I've come up with working with various of my grad students or former graduate students. Yoonji Kim is now an assistant professor at Seoul National University. Yuanshuo is at Zhejiang University. Austin Aldag is still here at Cornell finishing up. And what we've done is we've looked at large scale survey data of local governments across the entirety of the United States. And what we've come to is this idea that cities are actually trying to hang on. They're trying to balance service delivery with the fiscal stressors that they face, and that they're not really progressive. They're just pragmatic. They're balancing, they're sitting there in the middle, but there is a lot of spatial diversity in responses. And I'll show you some papers in a little while that Yuanshuo and I have done using geographically weighted regression to show that spatial diversity. It's not just that there's a locus of conditional means where everything is tending toward the center. There's actually a fair amount of diversity going on. And the sub-national state, we have 50 of them in the United States, they really matter because they're the ones that determine local government authority and finance. So let's think of cities as following a continuum from hollowing out, which is many cities in the UK and Detroit in the US, to holding the line, which is most of the cities in the US. and then to those who are really innovating even in a time of crisis. Now, back in 2014, Judith Clifton and I wrote a paper looking at this diversity. And in her case, she's based in Spain. She was looking at the real hollowing out that was happening in Spain after the Great Recession. And it was much deeper and darker than what we were seeing in the US. And so we thought about the potential for a Polanyi-style counter movement as cities try to hold on in a time of crisis. So as we think about this continuum of responses, you've got your hollowing out, Detroit, UK, Spain, they cut, but these are cities that actually have very little fiscal autonomy. Then you've got your pragmatic municipalism, which is most cities, and they're looking at new revenue sources, new service models. We even think of them as sort of riding the wave. Okay, we're in a wave of austerity. All right, but we'll have to ride it. And then at the far end, you have a very few progressive cities that are innovating in new things and even pushing their states to have more progressive policy. And I'll show you this at the end of the talk with states that have followed their leading cities in raising the minimum wage or protecting consumers from water shutoff, et cetera. So we have a new paper coming out in its early view in Public Administration Review. It's here at the bottom of the slide. And it's looking at US local government responses to fiscal stress. And indeed, we see a little bit of cuts, a little bit of revenue raising, and holding the line. So from a theoretical perspective, how do we think about this? So in the geography world, they like to use the word multi-scalar governance. That word implies there's different scales, like an economic scale, a government scale, but they're actually talking about multi-level governance. And I think that's important because in public administration, we have very well-known theories of fiscal federalism and public choice, which acknowledge this multi-level governance system and think about drivers of that system as really being competition and growth. So the city is part of a growth machine. It's trying to raise taxes to provide services, but also to keep taxes limited enough that you don't cause richer companies or residents to leave. When you get into a period of fiscal stress, then you look at cutback management, smoothing, cutting things that maybe people don't notice so much so that you can essentially ride the wave. The state rescaling is the name that geographers use to look at multi-level governance and the kinds of shifts that we're seeing happen. And we have this one set of theories of austerity urbanism, which is pretty dark and is built off particularly unique country contexts like Spain or the UK, or particular cities that are under special stress like Detroit in the US. And then we have the theory we've been proposing, which is pragmatic municipalism, which is in many ways more like cutback management. It's hanging on. So this growth machine has the idea, comes from Logan and Molach's older article talking about how cities and business elites come together. But we also have the notion that the local government would be the developmental state, that would be its goal, to promote development. And then austerity urbanism, as I've already mentioned, is a darker view, almost like the growth machine gone awry. And then cutback management is hanging on. And then with pragmatic municipalism, we have this idea of thinking about things and a continuum from hollowing out to riding the wave to push back. So the growth machine is the notion that there's exchange value that benefits local governments for their tax base and benefits business interests for their profits. And so real estate developers and land-based elites are big players in this growth machine, and they work together with local government. The local government in the US case is looking to enhance its tax base. In the Chinese case, it's looking to enhance its land lease revenue. And so a lot of people have used the growth machine argument even in the Chinese case. The austerity urbanism is that austerity pressures are so severe that they're pushing down on cities, and that's causing cities to cease meeting citizen needs, not to meet citizen needs anymore. And this we do find in some extreme cases of cities. But it's too gloomy and it's self-defeating. So at some level, it just doesn't quite make sense. Who at the local level would be a member of the austerity machine? What mayor wants to see her city decline? So while the theory might make sense when you think about it in a multi-level way of higher level government actors pushing their fiscal stress down to the city, why would the city want to undermine itself? That just doesn't make sense for local actors. So I think we really need to think about austerity urbanism as an austerity pressure that's coming from above, but is not really being generated from below. Because if you're underinvesting, that's going to lead to economic decline, which is going to lead to tax base erosion, which is going to lead to more underinvestment, and you'll get this vicious cycle going downward. And Yuanshuo and I have found this in a number of our papers, looking at some portion of US local governments that face this vicious cycle of decline, but they're by no means the majority. So the idea of pragmatic municipalism is that local governments are dealing with these pressures of fiscal stress, what's happening with state policy, the need to address citizen needs. And then they're saying, okay, where's my innovation space? What can I do? I can try alternative forms of service delivery. I can try new revenue sources, and I can try to seek a balance. So that's why you really do think of them as riding the wave. If any of you like to go surfing, that's what local governments are doing. They're riding the wave. And this is what Yunji and I did a paper, Kim and I did a paper using 2012 data to look at what was happening with levels of privatization after the Great Recession. And they did not rise in the US. Local governments were balancing. They were using a little bit of privatization and a little bit of intergovernmental cooperation with other municipalities, but it wasn't this dramatic increase in privatization that the austerity urbanism theorists were claiming. So when we think about sources of fiscal stress, I'll tell you a story. At the Urban Affairs Conference about, I don't know, 6 years ago, I was sitting there talking with Professor Liu from Peking University, the Lincoln Land Institute, and he said, oh, Mildred, let me tell you a Chinese story about how to boil a frog. And the pot gets hotter, it's warm, the frog's temperature adjusts, local governments temperature adjust. And then when you get to the point where the pot's gonna cook you, you don't have the energy to jump out anymore. And he said, we can think of local government as sitting in this pot, the heat's coming up. And what's making the heat go up? Changes in the economy, changes in state policy, changes in demography. And Austin Aldag's wife, Ni Nguyen, is a graphic artist. So she made us this picture of the frog in the pot. And actually last year, Yuanshuo was doing a presentation at Cornell, and Professor Liu came, and we had to say, hey, your idea? We turned it into a picture. So let's take that picture and put it now as a triangle. So we have the economy, economic restructuring. We have our Rust Belt. You have your declining cities. These cities often have aging infrastructure that needs to be replaced, but no tax base to pay for replacing it. Then you have your demographic pressures, poverty, population decline. I live in a state that's losing population, New York. We just lost a representative to the US House of Representatives because we've lost population. And that means those who are left are older, and older population have higher service needs. So you've got less economic growth, you've got an older population, you've got all these needs, and then you've got state policy pressuring you with issues of decentralization, pushing service responsibilities down to the local level. What's happening with state policy on decentralization and state aid? This varies across the 50 states, so it matters a lot. And then some states have put in tax and expenditure limits on local government. So you're really restricted. And this is what we want to look at. So we did a survey in New York State looking at, we surveyed all local governments in the state, cities, counties, towns, and villages. We got a 58% response rate, and we asked them about their levels of fiscal stress, what kind of response they were doing, what kind of narratives they were hearing, what kinds of coalitions they were forming. And then we linked this with actual finance data from the New York State Comptroller's Office. And what we saw is that the cuts were half of the level of new revenue and new service delivery options. So they were doing both, but on average, they were doing twice as much in terms of new innovative approaches as opposed to cuts. And they had these coalitions at the local level, which were not austerity coalitions. They were coalitions with unions, with local civic leaders, and they were coming up with a narrative to push back against this stress. So then we did a national level survey with the International City County Management Association in 2017. And here we had 2,300 cities and counties responding from across the United States. And again, we measure the pressures, state policy, economy, and demography. These are pushing down and giving you your local fiscal stress. And many governments aren't stressed at all. There's a few that are in high levels of stress and a few that say no stress, and most of them are kind of sitting in the middle with moderate levels of fiscal stress. And then we measured cuts, revenue enhancements, and deferrals. And what we found again was support for this pragmatic municipalism thesis. And again, we saw governments were more likely to balance across these choices if they had more citizen engagement and if they had higher levels of unionization. So hearing from your public is also important. So what about the role of the subnational state? So one of the main features that the subnational state, one of its main features is that it decentralizes fiscal responsibility and service responsibility down to the local level. And I've been looking at this issue for about 30 years because in the United States, we had a decentralization process from the federal to the state. That was, 60s, 70s, and then 80s, we start pushing more from the state to the local. So these later waves of decentralization have really shifted the importance of where we need to focus, not so much on what the nation is doing, but on what the 50 states are doing and how that affects local government. Because local governments are creatures of the state. The federal government doesn't have a lot of authority and doesn't give much money to local governments. So here's a paper that Yuanshuo and I published in 2016 in Environment and Planning A, and we were really interested. So this is before the Great Recession, and we're really interested in what is happening with the spatial differences in local government response to these two big policy choices that states have. So on the map on your left, you're seeing the coefficient, the distribution of the coefficient in the regression equation of state aid on local revenue effort. And what you see is that there are some states that have a positive response, that's in red, and that's complementary. So when the state gives them more aid, they in turn spend more money. So that's a complementary, and that can be actually a virtuous cycle. You get more money, you spend more money, you're investing, your economy is growing, and you head up. Then there's other states where it's substitutive, that's in blue, where when the state gives you more money, you then spend less. And this is what you would expect, that local governments would replace state money for their own and lower their tax rates. The red ones that are the concern for us are the ones where the state, remember, it's a positive relationship. So the state gives you less money and you in turn spend less money. And that gives you the underinvestment and the vicious cycle downward. And you notice that these red are in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida. These are states that are known for underinvesting in social welfare, underinvesting in their governments. And so at both the state and the local level, you're seeing this underinvestment cycle. The map on the right is looking at state centralization. So the state assuming responsibility for fiscal services at the state level. So it comes off the state budget where they have the income tax, whereas local governments in most states in the US don't have access to the income tax. They only have property tax, sales tax, and user fees. And so here you see that the substitutive response, which is what you would theoretically expect, happens in parts of the country, but you also see parts of the country where you have a complementary response. So when the state centralizes more, local government spends more, which is the opposite of what you would expect to see. And so the point of these maps is geography matters. There isn't one standard story across the country, and you need to pay attention to that when you do your work. So there's also the issue of the state constricting revenue tools. And this is looking at like tax and expenditure limits, which are now common in 47 of the 50 states. They're more severe in some states and less severe in others. In fact, they're not even a binding constraint in some states, and in other states, they're quite binding. And what we've discovered is that county governments are more likely to be affected by these than cities because counties have fewer alternative revenue sources. They're heavily reliant on the property tax and state aid. And cities have other revenue sources like user fees. Now, what we're now looking at, though, is that states are also preempting local policy authority. And there's a political element that's coming in here with corporate coalitions, not at the local level, but at the national and state level, coming together with state legislatures to pass laws that restrict local government authority, that restrict local government policymaking authority, whether it's to regulate Uber and ride sharing, or to regulate Airbnb, or to ban plastic bags, or to raise the minimum wage, or to protect LGBTQ rights. There's a whole range. And there's this group called ALEC, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council, that's funded by the Koch brothers, who are a very, very large set of multiple corporate interests, mostly in older industries like coal and gas, industries that aren't poised to do well in the 21st century. And so they're very much interested in restricting environmental regulations and supporting corporate interest. And they don't want local government to lead with innovative environmental policy, for example, or innovative labor policy. And so they have conferences every year, and they invite state legislatures to come to their conferences, and they give them model bills. They have lawyers that write model legislation, and they say, why don't you take this home and put it in your state? And they've been very successful. So Yuanshuo and I were doing a paper that just came out in the Cambridge Journal of Regions, Economy and Society this year. And we were looking at what explains why we've seen dramatic increases in productivity, but we haven't seen very good increases in returns to labor. There's this gap between what's happening with productivity and what's happening with returns to labor. And that gap is causing an uninclusive growth. And so we looked at all counties in the US for 2012, and we controlled for returns to labor and overall returns, and then looked at things like local government finance, economic structure, demographics, always this triangle. But then we put the state in. State political control is both the governor's office and the legislature controlled by Republicans. level of corporate influence. And there's a lawyer named Alex Hertel Fernandez who's written a book called State Capture, where he measured all these laws, thousands and thousands of laws, and how many of them were Alex sponsored and how many of them got passed by a state legislature. So we take these as in our multi-level model, we take these state level measures, and then we also control for local level economic structure, demographic structure, and what local government is doing. And what we discover is that where there's more corporate influence on the state legislative process, there's lower productivity and uninclusive growth. On the other hand, where there's more local government expenditure and higher levels of unionization, there's more productivity and inclusive growth. So we have a story here that the austerity coalition might be at the state level, corporate and state pushing down, but at the local level, we see an interest in promoting the development state still wants to exist, and it wants to promote a more equitable quality of life for its citizens. So we're just coming out of a horrendous, awful year of COVID-19 with terrible local government fiscal stress. When I think of last summer and the levels of stress local governments were facing, you just couldn't imagine where we were going to end up. But we know that recession and austerity for local governments is a political choice. It's not a necessity. It's a political choice made by higher levels of government. The state has the income tax. It has broader revenue sources. The federal government doesn't have to balance its budget. And so it can make money possible. And under COVID, we saw the US federal government making money possible for unemployed people, for the airlines, for small businesses, but not for state and local government, not until January. And in January of this year, they passed the American Rescue Plan with $350 billion to support state and local government. Now, this changes the picture. The austerity theorists need to step aside for a minute in the United States because we are not in a moment of austerity right now. Local governments across the country are trying to figure out what are the rules from the Federal Treasury Department on how they can spend this new money. And for the first time since the 70s, we're seeing significant federal money to local governments. We tend to not even pay that much attention to federal aid because it's so minuscule for local government. But right now, in this moment, this year, federal money is becoming available. So this leads to a new type of state rescaling. So we take the triangle I've been showing you for the last few slides, and notice how I've changed the words. Share expenditure responsibility, because that's what the ARPA is doing. It's sharing some of that expenditure responsibility by giving some federal money to state and local government. That expands the revenue sources for local government and their ability to do things. And also there's been some expansion of policy authority. So while there's been this pressure to restrict policy authority during COVID, for example, many states decided to protect their residents from shut off of drinking water. You know, the public health was you need to wash your hands. But in the United States, we do not have guaranteed access to drinking water. Unlike Europe, unlike a lot of places in the global South, utilities can cut you off if you don't pay your bill. 34 states put in moratoria on water shutoffs during COVID because people need to wash their hands. So will this continue as we move forward? Well, that's a good question. We've also looked at a number of states have raised their minimum wage. The federal government's not ready to raise minimum wage. There's not the support in Congress for that, but there is support at the state level, and 29 have raised their minimum wage is above the federal level. 36 expanded Medicaid access. This is healthcare insurance for low-income workers. And what we discovered in another paper I wrote with another postdoc of mine, Dr. Zhao, was that in states that had better social safety net protections, those were the states that put in their stay-home orders under COVID. They put them in earlier and they lifted them later because they had a social safety net that kept people from falling below. The states without a social safety net didn't want to shut down, and they reopened really early because people need to go to work to have income in order to survive. A social safety net is part of a public health policy. So back to this continuum. Yeah, we have some cities hollowing out. That's certainly true. But most cities in the United States are in this pragmatic municipalism arena of looking for new revenue sources, looking for new service models, trying to balance economics, services, and create a decent quality of life. And there's a few cities out there innovating, doing really special, fun, new things on environment, on social welfare, on social equity. And often those cities and their innovation stimulates states, the subnational states, to act. So yes, there's structural constraints, state policy. Yuanshuo and I are now finishing a paper arguing that fiscal federalism is broken because the old cooperative notions of fiscal federalism are broken. But we need to come up with theories that give possibilities for state local action because we're actually seeing it. We don't need theories that tell us that local government can't act. We need theories that tell us how local government can act. So yeah, there's path dependence. You're stuck with what you've got. But there's also this dynamic in state rescaling that offers the possibility for a Polanyian style pushback, or maybe some progressive action given the new federal policy frame, which is a very different federal policy frame than we've seen in decades. So back to our boiling frog. It's time to leap before it's too late. We've just put some ice cubes in that pot. We've just pulled away a little bit of the pressure on the heat. And so it's time to track expenditures, track shifts and expenditure choices and policy change, and see if there actually are any progressive possibilities in this moment. And that's a paper that actually Yuanshuo and I are working on right now. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your wonderful lecture. Can I actually invite Dean of Public Affairs at the Zhejiang University, Professor Zhao, to speak a few words?
Yeah, thank you. Well, good evening, good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And Yuanshuo at the beginning provided a really generous introduction on me as well, but I want to add a little bit that links particularly to this topic. Before I went to the United States, I was an urban planner for about 7 or 8 years. And then I studied in the University of Georgia, public administration, specialized in public budgeting and finance. But my interest has always at the local level. And then I lived for 2 years in Michigan, where I with firsthand experience about how local governments encounter fiscal challenges. Then I moved to Minnesota. Well, just this month, 1 month ago, I joined Zhejiang University, where I'm serving as the Dean of the School of Public Affairs, but I'm also a professor at the Department of Urban Development and Management. So it's the time for me to get back to the urban area. That makes one more connection to the topic today. Before I came, actually, I have long been planning with Professor Zhang Weiwen and Elaine on having this dialogue series. As Elaine mentioned really well, it's extremely important, it's even more critical to have conversations like this, to collaborate, to promote communication and more mutual understanding about all those challenges that we are facing together. And it's especially nice to have Mildred in this talk to open the whole series. Well, it's not only because you share the common interest with me, it's not only because you are the wonderful mentor of Yuanshuo, our excellent, brilliant young scholar, young colleague here at the school. I think it's also because it's so important to look at local fiscal issues from a wide range of perspectives. I know that we may have quite some colleagues and friends in the talk in China who study public finance from economic perspective. But it's important to see public budgeting and finance as an interdisciplinary field of study. We need certainly economic perspective, we need political science, we need management perspective, we need law, we need sociology. And I have long admired Mildred's work. I think it may in part have to do with her unique perspective with some combination of, I think, history and agricultural economics and developmental sociology. Mildred, you may not know that agricultural economics is another strength we have in our school. We have a really strong, I think it's top one or top two program of agricultural economics in our school. Well, with those opening, I would like to share 3 observations I have about this topic and 1 question. I certainly have a lot more questions if we're able to get Mildred here once well, things get back to normal-ish, but I would try to save more time for the audience. So the 3 observations. First, we are facing similar challenges in local finance in US, in China, in other places as well. Mildred mentioned about those ongoing challenges like economic, demographical, or policy-related challenges. And certainly right now we're in this once in a lifetime historical event, this COVID thing, and all those things change the way local governments would, how they get money, how they spend money, how they try to leverage financial resources from borrowing or other ways, and how they manage their precarious financial condition. And the second is there's so much that we can learn from each other. Before I went to Michigan, I mentioned that I lived for 2 years in Michigan in the city of Ypsilanti. It's not too far from the city of Detroit. And where I directly see what they say is how the city have been cut to bonds. They are losing so many, well, so much percentage of the budget, the whole city hall of the city of Ypsilanti. Well, they have maybe half the office closed, the other half heavily rely upon free intern students that I send them. And in Michigan, I also work together with a colleague, well, who for a period of time served as the financing director, the finance director of the city of Flint. And I think it's with my direct experience in Michigan with cities like Detroit and Flint that actually made me more cautious about local fiscal sustainability in China. Like we're seeing all the boom of like infrastructure, of buildings, of everything, but it's unlikely that you can sustain a high-speed boom like this. It's very likely, and actually right now we are seeing some cities that may start to shrink. And we would know that a boom and bust of population and economic activities tend to be the perfect recipe for fiscal stress. So China really need to plan ahead. And certainly there are many possible solutions. There are many ways we can try. There are many tools that we can tap on, but local governments should start to take on those issues seriously. So that's some of my learning carrying from US observation to China. We can see the other way around as well. I feel that my previous experience as urban planner in China played a really significant role in my research about infrastructure finance in Minnesota, in the US. And there are so many ways that we feel that we should come together. Like on the Chinese side, there are many experiments that could have implications for the US as well. On the US side, there's many things, experiences and lessons that would be really helpful to China. So that's the second aspect. And the third is by working together across countries, US, China, and many other countries, I think that's the best way we can advance theory and practice. When I just moved to the US in the year of 2000, well, for a period of time, I kind of feel that PA, public administration, basically reads American public administration. But right now, I think it's not that case anymore. We realize that it's simply not feasible to ignore those issues that would have global implications, ignore the collaboration that we need across all the countries. And that's something that I really, really appreciate when I occasionally get the opportunity to attend conference in Europe, right? They have the natural tendency, they will say, well, this is how things happen in US, how they deal with things, this what happens in UK, in Germany, and others. That's the kind of global perspective, that's the kind of international competency that we should really cultivate in all public affairs schools. I think that's something that we would certainly want to promote more in China, particularly in our Zhejiang University. And we really, really hope that we can get this COVID thing over soon. And Mildred, we can get you here. We can get many other colleagues and friends here. We have so many things that we can work together. Well, so those are my observations. Then I would get to my one question. Mildred, you mentioned you have this excellent introduction of the two competing theories, or perspectives, or two mindsets: austerity urbanism and pragmatic municipalism. I've been thinking what determines which pathway a city would take when they encounter fiscal difficulties. You have talked about the COVID-19 response, in which the federal government plays a huge role. Well, we know that the COVID will be over, but the local governments are sure to face many other challenges as well. In many of the challenges, we may not be able to expect federal government to print so much money to help. So many of the things, I think, will still be in their own hands. So I'm really curious, what are the key factors of the pathway that they can take or they should take? Is it about the social economic environment? Is it about the capacity, or is it more about political will? So that's the question for you. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry, for 3 points. My former dean, Kishore Mahbani, always like to use 3 points. Can Yuanshuo actually collect 1 or 2 more questions, Lane? Because many questions now.
Okay, so yeah, let's just start our Q&A session. Mildred, do you want address Jerry's question first, or you want to hear the audience feedback? Which one do you prefer?
Well, I've also been reading the chat. And okay, so it's great to, that's what I love about Zoom, is we can see things on chat as well. And I'd like to, what determines which path a city will take? I'll start with that, Jerry.
Okay.
And a lot of people talk about capacity. Does the city have the capacity to respond? And right now what we're seeing is a lot of the smaller cities and rural places do not have the capacity to deal with the complexity of the money allocated by the federal government in the American Rescue Plan. And so some cities are deciding not to participate because they don't have the technical capacity to play with all the rules to pull that money down. So you need to think about simplicity in policy design so that even your weakest and poorest cities can access the resources. And you also should think about technical assistance to help them access those resources. And so one of the reasons why we have a multi-level system of government is sometimes it makes more sense to put things at the state level where there may be more capacity rather than passing everything down to the local where capacity is very uneven. But the problem is also the issue of political will. Some of our states don't have the political will to invest the money in social welfare. And so if you want it invested in social welfare, sticking it at the state level may not get your goal. And so the politics do matter. I saw there was a question in the chat asking how much of this maps on to, Republican versus Democratic politics. Well, it's partly that. It's partly also urban, rural, suburban differences. This is another thing we pay a lot of attention to. And the needs and interests of large cities can often be quite different from the needs and interests of suburbs and rural places. And there's not a lot of political partisan commonality between them. And so when we think about policy design, they have a phrase they use in England called rural proofing. It's like, think about your policy design and you ask, is this going to work differently in a city or a suburb or a rural area? And how might I design the policy to better meet those diverse needs? And so the diversity of need and experience can manifest itself in political partisan differences, but I don't think it has to be political partisan. When we look at privatization, we find that the levels of privatization in the United States are not differentiated by political partisan positions. They're differentiated by the nature of the market that the local government faces. If you're in a market where there's a lot of competition, you might try privatization. If you're in a market where there isn't much, you're not going to, because it won't work. And so political partisanship can be a screen for policy design, not thinking about geographic diversity. So I think that's really important. And just like there's rural proofing, there's also been gender proofing, you know, looking at differences by gender. So as a policy designer, ask yourself the question, is there diversity out there? Yes. What kind of diversity? What drives it? That's what Yuanshuo and I have been trying to figure out. And then what does that mean for different policy design? Because I'm ready to assume that in the United States, most local governments are in this pragmatic position. They want to do what works. Give them a little flexibility to do what works in their setting, and it'll be okay. Now, if you don't trust your local governments and you think that they're out to destroy their cities, which just doesn't make sense, or they're out to grow their cities too fast in a way that's not sustainable, then you might want to put guardrails on them. But if you think that local leaders are actually trying to do stuff, give them the capacity and give them a little flexibility, and then watch and see what they do. And if they're veering too far out, you can put the guardrails on. But I think we in public administration need to think much more carefully about policy design and not assume one size fits all.
Okay. Thanks, Mildred. So we have collected some questions from the audience. One question is from, you already addressed one about this geographic pattern, you know, related to the political party control. So the other question also came from Wei Li. He or she asked, like, could you also explain more on progressive action, maybe the idea of progressive city? Do you mean increasing state aid, local government? Because like China is also like try to implement the new urbanization program to make our city more progressive, more inclusive, you know, in terms of the growth. So could you explain more about this idea on progressive city?
So back in the 1970s, when we were in another fiscal crisis moment, there were a number of cities that really tried to do things in new ways, and they've been chronicled. Bernie Sanders was mayor of Burlington, Vermont at the time. Jerry Flynn was in Boston. Harold Washington was in Chicago. And Pierre Clavel wrote a book about the progressive city, progressive municipalism, and the way they were thinking about a city that had inclusive growth. So you're in a deindustrialized moment. Deindustrialization is starting at this time. And so you're thinking about worker ownership forms. You're thinking about investing in community colleges and more access for your residents. So capital is mobile, labor is a little less mobile. So let's pay attention to the residents in our city and creating a good quality of life for them. So that was sort of the idea. When Yoonji Kim and I were coming up with this idea of pragmatic municipalism, it's like what we're seeing is not progressive. At best, it's pragmatic. But what are we seeing? We're seeing cities wanting to get ahead on climate change. When you don't have national leadership, as we have not until most recently, you see cities taking the lead and going ahead and changing their zoning rules, changing their building codes, and trying to move forward on environment, on social justice. With all the Black Lives Matter movement last summer, a number of cities went forward to reform their police departments. So there is progressive action. It's not a lot. You could fall into the same theoretical problem of the austerity urbanists, that there's not that much austerity, frankly. There's not that much progressivity, frankly, but there's a lot of folks sitting in the middle. And how do we help those cities in the middle be creative, become more sustainable? Because over the long term, local government needs different sources of finance. The property tax is not enough. Most of our economies in the US are heavily in education and medical institutions, which are often nonprofit, so they don't pay any tax. You in China don't yet have a property tax, but you've got to come up with some source of revenue other than land leasing, because that is not going to be sustainable into the future. So in this COVID moment, where we've seen the critical importance of local government, we need to imagine new ways of organizing and financing local government. And what's been so fascinating is that these little measures we have of labor power or local citizen engagement, we realize that actually helps local government become more inclusive, become more sustainable. So it's not just technical support from above or aid from above or the capacity of the local leadership or even the political party. Your people who live there, who work there, if you can let them get engaged in the process, we're seeing in almost all our work, when you engage women and children and elders in planning, they plan cities that are better for children and elders. When you have a citizen advisory task force, you get on your environment, you get better environmental policy. When you have unions active, you're going to get more inclusive growth. So there's a message there. There's a message there for involving your public in helping you to create the city that they want to live in. So there's a lot of diversity. I guess that's one of the things to come away from this is when you think about your continuum, you know, is there a continuum? Like I'm finding the majority of cities in the US are sitting in this pragmatic middle. But I'm thinking about Yuanshuo, in your dissertation research, did you see a pragmatic middle on Chinese cities, or did you see these very divergent paths? You need to pay attention to the spatial difference because you need to design your policy to address that spatial difference.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Mildred. Another question is from Mark Robbins. He's from University of Connecticut. He want to know like how the cooperative mechanism of fiscal federalism are broken, which is the idea we have talked about, and how does that affect pragmatic municipalism? So he wants to know like the relation. Yeah. Okay.
So we have this naive notion of cooperative federalism where we're all in the same game together, and we want to make a more efficient, capacious local and state government, and we want to have good quality of life and economic development. That's the idea. The problem is we have, with state rescaling, and this is where Jamie Peck has a very, very useful notion, this notion of scalar dumping, that actually under fiscal stress, what we have in a federalist system is the state trying to dump its responsibilities down on the local. And that resolves the state's fiscal crisis. And there's a lot of incentives for states to do that. Pass the responsibility down to local without the money to pay for it, and then tell the citizens, oh, you know, we're not the ones cutting your services. It's your bad local government doing that. It's their job, without saying we didn't give them the money to provide the service. So the power of scalar dumping is huge. And that's what has undermined cooperative federalism. That's uncooperative federalism. Now, can a city be pragmatic in that context? A city has no choice. Cities don't have that much power. They are creatures of the state. And if the state is putting policy on them that restricts what they can do, then they have to live within that. It's like the frog in the pot. The water's getting hotter. But there are little ways that you can jump out. Like when we did our paper on tax and expenditure limitations, we discovered that cities, because they have more revenue choices, they look for more user fees. And they look for user fees, not just people think of user fees, oh, they're so terrible because they hurt poor people. Well, I'm sitting here at Cornell, which owns 40% of Ithaca, the land base, and doesn't pay property tax on any of it. And lots of communities are heavily invested in education and medical institutions that are nonprofits that don't pay the property tax. So design user fees so they pay, which is exactly what this city has done. And so these are things that are what pragmatic places do. Syracuse up the road an hour has less payments in lieu and taxes from Syracuse University and the University Hospital than Ithaca does from Cornell. They use political pressure with unions to help make that happen down here. And so we need to, in China and in the US, we need to redesign local government finance. It is not sustainable for the 21st century. You can't keep growing cities and having land lease payments to pay for city development in China. That game is over. You got to come up with something more sustainable. We can't just sit on an old 19th and 20th century notion of property tax when the economy has moved to sectors that don't pay property tax. So we need to come up with different mechanisms, whether that's allowing all cities to have income tax, whether it's some kind of corporate tax. We need to figure it out.
Okay, thank you, Mildred, for explaining this idea of the broken fiscal federalism. We have many questions. I try to cover them all. Like another questions, which is about to ask you to explain why local governments choose different actions. I think you already sort of like addressed that. For example, some go for pragmatic, others go for progressive, maybe others go for austerity. What theory could explain the different choice? Yeah.
So as Jerry was saying when he was in Ypsilanti, Michigan, I mean, Michigan is a poster child for austerity. Just like in the UK, if you're heavily dependent on intergovernmental aid and they cut it in half, guess what? You're constrained. Your fiscal policy space, as Michael Pagano would say, has just gotten really narrow. In the US, because cities are 70% on their own, they have a lot more fiscal policy space. But in Michigan, you had deindustrialization, you had declining population, you had aging population, and you had dramatic cuts in state aid because the state was also under fiscal stress and it was dumping its stress down to the city. Those cities, austerity urbanism helps explain what's going on. And the coalition is really coming from the state. That's what I think we need to acknowledge. The cities that are more progressive usually are the ones that have a booming economy and they have some flexible room to maneuver. So this continuum, that's why we always control the triangle or the three logs in the fire. You know, there's the economy, there's demography, and there's state policy. And then there's what you do. You're the frog in the pot. What do you do to jump out, to cool the water? And so there's a lot of variety out there. And that's what you need to do. There's a question, Yuanshuo, that I wish you would take from Jahi Liang. Which municipalism do you think fits most to explain local government's actions in China? Growth, austerity, or pragmatic?
He's actually my student.
Good for you.
I was going to bring that question to you. Okay, I think again, I totally agree about this, spatial diversity. Like in China, we also have shrinking cities, that is experiencing this industrialization, pretty much like the Rust Belt city in US. So like, I also like, maybe they will have some austerity, strategies. I also like in China, the central government also have that vision for those shrinking cities to be more right-sizing, for both spatial and maybe the service as well. But we also have some new state-based cities, right, from new brander ideas. like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen. They are more like the growth machine. And maybe other, the majority of the cities could be in pragmatic. So that's my first sense about these questions. So we also have this spatial diversity, and in my dissertation, which I use some techniques to reveal that pattern from this, right? So spatial diversity is it really matters, I guess.
So I'd like to go back to the third point that Jerry made about advancing theory and practice through cross-country analysis. So as you're talking, Yuanshuo, about these shrinking cities, one could imagine a project looking at shrinking cities in deindustrialized spaces, looking at shrinking cities in Eastern Germany, where there's been a huge amount of shrinkage, and it's raised all sorts of questions about what do you do with this excess space, and shrinking cities in China, and learning across them as you think about policy choices. Too much research focuses just on the big growth centers as if they were representative of every place, which they aren't. And then there's all this research that focuses just on the declining places, which again is just a portion. Where I think we in public administration often, because we do large scale models, we tend to capture the majority in the middle. But a lot of theory misses the majority in the middle because it's excited by case studies over here, or by exciting, I want to go study Shanghai because it's so exciting over here. And looking in the middle, I think, can teach us a lot, because our goal is to move the majority of cities to a good, sustainable place. So, and I think you got to be careful not to get captured by the exciting theory of the day, or a theory that's come out of one particular context and doesn't actually travel that well to another context. And particularly theories coming out of English language contexts tend to dominate in the international literature, because the international literature is in English. And it's as if that's the only way to see things. And I want to strongly encourage particularly people in this division to not just be on fancy empirical models, but also to think theoretically, what contributions are you making to push and broaden the theory into a more international comparative vein?
Thank you, Mildred. So the trump of the city is really the trump of the several cities, right? Not all the cities. Just interpret your feedback. Okay, so we got a lot of questions. Another question is to I think he or she want to know like the response from the local people. Like, are people okay with that austerity strategy, the cut of the programs? Are people happy or maybe get mad? So they want to know like how the people respond to the austerity strategies.
So this austerity theory is powerful. Like somebody asked an earlier question about, where does it make sense? And it makes sense with scalar dumping, right? The higher level state is dumping its fiscal stress down on the local and solving its own fiscal problem. There's also a really dark side about it with citizens, and the idea that as the state cuts services to citizens, citizens then lose their expectation of citizenship rights from the state. So the higher level state pushes the service down to the local without the money. The local can't deliver. The citizen goes, well, gee, the state doesn't give me anything. I don't have any faith in the state. I don't connect to the state. That's what gives you Trumpism in the United States. And that's what gives you citizen disaffection. And you got to watch out for that. When China broke its iron rice bowl, you have to, and you gave them growth instead. Now that growth is going away, what are you giving them? And you need to keep your citizens feeling like the state is offering them something. And what austerity theories say is that austerity breaks the social contract between citizen and state. It fundamentally undermines it. I don't want to go there. I don't want to be in that world. I don't think in public administration we want to be in that world. So if we want to be in that world, we need to think about how you can keep that citizen connection to state, and services are a big part of it. That the state needs to have the capacity to deliver some services that people actually want. Now, we can do all sorts of new approaches. We can do things differently. We can try to save money. We can involve citizens in co-production. We can do lots of things, but we need to think about how we keep that citizen-state connection and how we keep it healthy. And that's where you're asking, Jerry, can we have a theory of the boiling frog? How do you get out of the pot? How do you pull those logs away that are heating it up? How do you put ice cubes in? And I think there's a real role for the citizen here. And thinking how we use that, not a lower expectation of the citizen, but a higher expectation and a sense of connection to government. So I'm happy to pay my taxes because they give me good services. But there needs to be that connection.
Yeah, thank you, Mildred. Also, like in China, we are kind of like pushing some efforts to equalizing the service rights and urban rights for urban and rural people. So we are working on that. So I think that's kind of confirm your citizen expectation perspective on this. So another question is kind of the follow-up. Like if you're a political official, for example, like which one may give you more political benefits and also the cost between this pragmatic. So for pragmatic, you may get more political benefits from your local citizens, for example. And for austerity, you may get some other political benefits, that's my guess. So if you look at that question, it says, could you please elaborate more on the political benefits and costs of pragmatic municipalism, if it is pragmatic? How does that compare to austerity? Urbanism?
So I just don't see any political benefits of austerity at the local level. In the US, mayors are elected. Who's going to re-elect a mayor who cut your services? Forget it. Now, when you're in a society that has unelected mayors like China or Germany, they're appointed by a party at a higher level, then maybe you'll get away with a mayor that's not providing adequate services. But in a more democratic context, I think that'd be kind of hard to do. Either that, or you do a big PR campaign that causes people to think you're great when you're not, which people can also do. So the austerity machine at the local level, I just don't see the political benefits of that. The personal benefits, I get rich because I'm corrupt, sure, but the political benefits to keep me in my position, I don't think so. I think where it happens is between levels. This is where we need studies that look between levels, because so the state gets a political benefit of pushing its stress down to the local and blaming the local, that's the narrative, the blame game, for what the state couldn't do, right? Didn't do, but they blame the local. That worked in Michigan, that worked in New York. But the local, we have a phrase in the US, the buck stops here. The local is the last level. And when it hits local, you don't have anywhere to go. You can't dump it. All you can do is actually strip services from your citizens, and they're not going to be happy about that. But at higher levels of government, you can play this game. And that's why we're saying federalism is broken, because it's not cooperative. It's playing this blame game, this scalar dumping game. And so we need more theory looking at the role in the United States, looking at the role of the subnational state, those 50 states that make 50 very different choices in how they treat their local governments. So there's a lot of theoretical work to be done at this level of the state to the local and how it behaves.
Sure. So Mildred, that might be this might be the last questions because of the time limits from David Guo and also Elaine. I think they asked kind of similar questions about the local government's utilization of the COVID relief funds. Maybe just connect that with a little bit more about social equity proofing.
So the COVID relief funds can be used for infrastructure, water, sewer, broadband, because COVID showed us that these are critical infrastructures. They can be used for essential workers. They can be used to help people who were most hurt by COVID. So local governments are invited to do something relative to social equity with this funds. There's like 8 things they can use it for, and social equity is embedded in those. They can also use it to replace lost revenue, and they have to go through a formula to show that their revenue has been lost. So what we're wondering is, will this be a moment where there might actually be progressive action because there's extra money? There's been societal pressure with the Black Lives Matter movement demonstrations last summer that something needs to be done about structural inequity and racism. And there's this guidance that says, use COVID as your opportunity to come out of this building a somewhat different world. So this is there's the possibility of a progressive moment. It ain't gonna happen unless there's a lot of work done to really make it real. And what I'm worried about is if we hang on to these austerity, urbanism theories, we'll give a screen for local governments not to use this money in equity enhancing ways. I think there's a real danger. I think austerity urbanism is a danger as a theory right now, in a moment when we have extra money, societal pressure, calling attention to structural inequities. For you, it's rural urban, Hukou. For us, it's racism and structural inequity, and you have money to do it. Like, let's take this horrible pandemic and let's turn it into the foundation for building a more equitable society. We can do that. And we need theories to help us think about how to do it. So maybe we need some people to look at what progressive cities have done, how they've done it, how they've organized, and take those models and use them to take it into the broad middle to help the middle move more in that direction.
Thank you, Mildred. Alfred said he read a lot of your articles. And he said he needs to read the latest ones. Okay, I'm gonna turn to Alfred for the closing statement. Okay.
I really agree with Professor Warner. The pandemic actually make us rethink a lot of things happening to us, and also we learn a lot. Thank you everybody for participation, and also really thanks Professor Warner for your talk, and particularly I'm quite impressed by your deep knowledge about Chinese public administration.
Not much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
So
you.
let me just add one more thing. I would like to thank Professor Warner again, and for your insights, and also thank everybody to be here. I just want to briefly say that so a lot of people are asking for videos, and we will provide the link to the video free of charge to everybody. Okay, and that's number one. And the second, we want encourage you to join the section that will enable us to provide those public these public service seminars free of charge continuously to everybody. And third, I want to say this is the first of a series of lectures that will be coming up, and we will be providing these lectures at the pace of one every month. Okay, once a month. So if you are interested in learning more about these lectures, please, contact the Hanjin and, just get the information through the channel that you got the information about this lecture. Okay, so, join us. So we will be happy to loop you in, and together, we will build theory and hopefully improve practice in our respective field. All right. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks again, Mildred and everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, so look forward to see Jerry in person.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.